This is Breakpoint This Week, a weekly briefing on faith, culture, worldview, and mission with John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview.
Well, welcome to Breakpoint This Week. John Stonestreet here along with Shane Morris. Shane, I want to start our conversation today. We got plenty of stories that we can get to, and we'll get to as many as we can. But November the 9th, Saturday, is an anniversary, I think, that's worth remembering, the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I'm old enough to remember that. I mean, I remember the images and the pictures coming out of people climbing this wall, pulling them down. I even remember Ronald Reagan's famous line years before, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. It was a stunning tail end, one of the chapters of the fight against evil in the world. Not that the West is flawless, but what we saw was the downfall of the Soviet Union. And this was just really unbelievable. And it's something that I think a lot of people, especially young people today, they don't have that cultural memory. They don't have the cultural memory of the struggle against global communism and what that meant for America and what that meant for the world.
Well, I was a year and 6 days old at the time, so I actually have a good excuse for not having that particular piece of cultural memory, John. But, this is a worldview program, and this is an event that has shaped the 3 decades that I've been alive. And so I think we should really point out that the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union's ultimate fall, both of those were really symbols of communism's failure, not just as a political system, but as an ideology, an economic system, and a worldview overall. The wall was built to keep East Germans in. Too many of them were leaving. There was the brain drain problem, because they saw what the democratic West had to offer and how much better it was. And before the wall was even built, I found this amazing quote from Soviet East German ambassador Mikhail Pervukin. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but he said, "The presence in Berlin of an open and essentially uncontrolled border between the socialist and capitalist worlds unwittingly prompts the population to make a comparison between both parts of the city, which unfortunately does not always turn out in favor of the democratic East Berlin." I mean, what a statement. What a statement. He openly admits that communism is failing in this head-to-head matchup with a freer form of government and society. It just can't survive the competition. People wouldn't stay in the East. And so what did they do? They built a wall. And that wall stood for, decades before it finally fell as a precursor to the fall of the communist system in the Soviet Union as a whole.
Yeah, that's right. And I think we need to remember, and this is something that when I say I think many young people don't have this cultural memory. And it's not just because they're young, too. It's also because we don't tell our history very well. We don't, tell about kind of what are the fundamental principles that the American experiment is about, and how does that conflict. We spend a whole lot of time talking about our failures. And look, I don't think it's any better to just spend all of the history of Western Civ ignoring all the ways that Western Civ has actually harmed people. But look, the fundamental problem of seeing them as pawns in a larger game, as seeing them primarily as consumers of resources, and not giving them the freedom of association, the freedom of press, the freedom of religion that allows them to be innovative and not just be part of the problem. It's part of the it actually be part of the solution. And I think we continue to see that over and over and over again. That's why we have major youth movements in America that are socialist or even outright communist. It comes from just an ignorance of the past, a group that has not been taught, hey, here's what history has brought to us. And you also see that same fundamental mistake about what it means to be human and a whole lot of other things in our culture. Here's another story from this week, Shane, that I want to kind of conflate here if I can. This week, there were 11,000 signatures from scientists that called for population control to fight global warming. Now, to be clear, it wasn't just population control, but here's the report from Bloomberg. We declare with more than 11,000 scientist signatories from around the world clearly and unequivocally that planet Earth is facing a climate emergency. Now, that's not anything new, claiming that this is what our planet is facing, that human-caused climate control is, the science is settled and all that. And we've talked more about that in the past. I don't want to get to that. But here's the policymakers' call for change. It's beyond just reducing carbon emissions. It's beyond all that. Essentially, that we have to make family planning services available to all people, remove barriers to access, and limit the population. Whenever I hear calls for limiting the population, it's making that same mistake that communism fundamentally made, which is that humans are fundamentally the problem that needs to be solved. There's a fixed set of resources, and that there's only so many resources to go around for so many people. So the worst thing that can happen is for some people to take more resources or to have too many people consuming the resources. There's not enough pieces of the pie to go around, ostensibly. And that's a fundamental mistake, because the reason that this communist official that you quoted earlier, Shane, was able to look at kind of the East and the West and say, the West is better, is because the West understood that people, yes, at some level are a problem to be solved, but also part of the solution themselves. They're not just consumers of goods, they're producers of goods. In other words, people can go into the pie of resources and bring their innovation and their hard work and their creativity and their thoughtfulness and their entrepreneurship. And actually the pie starts to get better. There's more big and bigger. There's more resources to go around. It's more efficient. We get better ways of distributing the resources, not to mention just flat out more food. And it's a fundamental worldview question that we talk about all the time on Breakpoint, which is that question of anthropology. What does it mean to be human? I think that many people that are kind of leading the current climate change hysteria are making that same mistake about what it means to be human as communism does. I don't know if you'd agree or not, but that's my take on it.
Oh, I absolutely would agree. Both of these ideological systems that you're talking about, whether communism or this sort of Malthusian population trap idea in its current global warming iteration, they both make that same assumption that humans don't fundamentally change the systems that we rely on. Like, we're animals, Right. One of our colleagues, Roberto Rivera, likes to talk about how Malthusian theory basically relies on the assumption that people are like rats. We're just going to keep on breeding and eventually use up all the available resources, and then there's going to be a population correction. But when I wrote an article, it's got to be a couple of years now ago at the Federalist about Thomas Malthus and this whole theory, and then Paul Ehrlich, who wrote The Population Bomb, which is easily the best known book on this overpopulation thesis. And the long story short is the overpopulation idea from both of these guys and all of their peers in between, and it's all it's formed since, has produced nothing but failure after failure after failure when it comes to predictions. I mean, it has just been one of the most disproven theories in history, and yet it just keeps cropping up. I'm not even exaggerating here. There were prophecies back in Ehrlich's day that doomsday would strike by the mid-1980s, John, that metal would become too expensive for industry to even survive. Most famously, he predicted that Great Britain and India wouldn't exist by the time I was born. But guess what? They all failed. They all failed miserably. So much so that the New York Times actually ran this great essay a few years ago about all of the failed predictions of overpopulation. That was the New York Times, mind you. At some point, that track record has become so bad that when we hear a new claim in line with the overpopulation thesis, I think the only rational thing to do is sort of stop listening, or at least to receive it with tremendous doubt.
Yeah, I think that's right, because again, you're looking at one single thing and not looking at the whole picture of the possibilities of what humans could do. I mean, who could imagine, when those predictions were made of the internet, of handheld internet that now makes all kinds of new financing opportunities and distribution of goods and, moving of markets across borders, made all of that possible in a way that it wasn't possible before. It's just a very, very limited view. I mean, I find it really funny, Shane, when you talk about how much they have failed in their predictions, because look, not only have they missed in their prediction that there's going to be global chaos and we're going to be plummeted into another level of poverty and things like that. But global poverty, and what I mean by that is abject poverty, starvation level poverty around the globe, right, has been cut in half in just the last 30 years because of these innovations. In other words, they're not even on the same trend line as what the reality has shown. Well, you're listening to Breakpoint this week. John Stonestreet here along with Shane Morris. Got lots more to cover. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
We invite you to visit breakpoint.org, and while you're at our website, be sure to browse our online Colson Center store of books and other resources, and you can find links to our social media sites like Facebook and Twitter.
Back on Breakpoint this week, John Stonestreet here talking with Shane Morris. Shane, one of the things that you can always get in trouble with when you dip your toe in these waters around, doing Christian commentary, doing, worldview commentary, is the origins debate. How old is the earth and that sort of thing. And I want to point, and we spent some time this past week, both in articles, on the podcast on Wednesday. If you missed that podcast with Jay Richards, we talked about the passing of a giant, somebody who made such an enormous influence and impact in this whole conversation. It's really hard, I think, to calculate how far this impact is going to go in the future. Phillip Johnson, widely regarded as the founder of the modern intelligent design movement. And please come to breakpoint.org, and we'll link you to the Breakpoint commentary from Wednesday, as well as the conversation that Jay Richards and I had. Jay was personally influenced by Phillip Johnson. I only met Dr. Johnson once, but at the same time, his impact goes on and on and on and on. And known for a book called Darwin on Trial, which really, I think, I don't know if I would call it a bombshell in that it shook the scientific or academic world. Certainly, the scientific world is still deeply tied to Darwinian evolution and this kind of philosophical naturalism. But I do think it shook a whole lot of Christians who were also scientists into joining this new movement. And now it's grown and it's bigger. And I think Darwinism is more vulnerable than ever.
Yeah, I would call Darwin on Trial more of a signpost than a bombshell. It pointed the right direction for so many who came after and alongside Phillip Johnson, because he challenged Darwinism on the level it most needed to be challenged, which was the worldview or philosophical assumptions that sort of underpin it. And the main assumption that he saw as underpinning Darwinism was this idea of philosophical naturalism, or what's sometimes called materialism. In other words, that everything we see in the world around us, including life, including ourselves, is explainable purely in terms of unguided material processes acting over long periods of time. That's textbook Darwinism. An intelligent agency or creative foresight, they've got no part of it. They're ruled out of court from the beginning. Johnson was one of the first to sort of challenge that assumption in what I think is an accessible way that didn't make explicitly religious or biblical arguments, even though he was, of course, a Christian. And, of course, he opened the gate to a movement of ID authors who had the training to actually delve into this stuff, who refined and extrapolated his arguments, often in really specialized fields. Authors like Michael Behe and Stephen Meyer and Douglas Axe and Bill Dembski, and it just goes on and on. They're arguing from the standpoint of whether it's genetics or biochemistry or paleontology or philosophy of science, that naturalism as an idea underpinning Darwinism just doesn't stand up to scrutiny, nor, John, does it work in practice to even produce life or the spectacular variety of life that we see around us. It doesn't even work on a mathematical or chemical level. But it all really started with this powerful idea that Johnson had, that he so clearly articulated in his debut book.
Yeah, it really did. And I think there's two main contributions. You mentioned one of those, which is, basically that philosophical naturalism is not sustainable. It's not actually what we see whenever we see, and this has been so fully fleshed out by so many of the names that you mentioned who joined, the Discovery Institute and kind of the larger intelligent design movement. Whenever we see written text, we assume that it had an author. Whenever we see design, we assume a designer. And that's all he was really pointing to, is that this fundamental assumption of Darwinian evolution is just not the best explanation for what we've seen. And now, when you talk about Steve Meyer pulling out basically the written language that is our human genetics, and and pointing to that, and the irreducible complexity that Behe talked about, and how that points to his designer. That's one side of it, which is great. One of the things I also appreciated is, and let me see if I can say this in a way that makes the most sense, Johnson wasn't a scientist. He was a lawyer, which immediately was one of the reasons he got shot at so much. It's like, well, you're not a scientific expert. But one of the things he was pointing out, which has proven to have serious legs, is that the implications of science are affecting everything else. And I think that when we look at so many Christians involved in the academy, we have to not only be personally faithful and be moral and be ethical and nice and loving to our neighbors, we have to rethink the rules of our areas of discipline, realizing that these disciplinary areas are themselves built off of a worldview. And when it came to science, it was like, I often say this, Shane, if Darwin had stayed in biology, it would just be a bad idea, but it wouldn't have been a big deal. But Darwin didn't stay in biology. That's the story of the 20th century. The assumptions of Darwinian evolution, that there's no cause, no process, no design, no mind, no purpose. This is what Friedrich Nietzsche was trying to argue in ethics and in sociology, and what the great postmodern philosophers of the 20th century took and built off of. And, so Johnson, for example, in a terrific First Things piece, and we'll link to this at breakpoint.org, argues, look, the problem is that if this is true about science, then this is true about law and ethics. We can't ground our ethics in anything eternal, in anything unchanging, in anything more than a power struggle. And that's exactly, of course, what Nietzsche was arguing for. But Darwin makes it intellectually possible, and then people make it even further to this kind of grand says who, as one thinker put it, or this grand relativism. And it's one thing if I say, well, you can't tell me what to think, everyone determines for themselves. It's a whole other thing when, national and international ethics and public policy becomes just a power struggle. And isn't that exactly what we're seeing right now with identity politics? Shane, this is what we mean when we say ideas have consequences. And for Phillip Johnson to be courageous enough to question that fundamental idea, that's why we hold him up as somebody that is worth mentioning. And I know he meant a lot to Chuck Colson as well.
Yeah, he was an irreplaceable giant. I know he's going to be missed. I know he had an impact on me. But I think as we said on Breakpoint, the high points of his legacy have yet to be written. I think this movement is really still in its infancy. It's influenced so many. He was the spark that, as I think he might have made the comparison himself. He said that the Darwinist had piled up, the materialist had piled up all the logs of error and presumption and false presuppositions. And all he did was light the match, John. He was the little kid who said, hey, the emperor is actually naked. I know you guys are all saying that materialism works, but it doesn't. And look at the terrible world it creates. The worldviews we talked about earlier, the materialist ideas of overpopulation and communism, these all come back to this grand idea of seeing humans as the product of time and chance and accidents. And that is an is from which you derive a very fallacious ought. It's a broken way of thinking, and for Johnson to expose that, I think, was more valuable than any purely scientific critique of Darwinism.
You're listening to Breakpoint this week. John Stonestreet here along with Shane Morris. Come to breakpoint.org. Click on the link on the homepage that says resources mentioned on the radio and podcast. We did an awful lot of tribute this week to Phillip Johnson, and we want you to see it. Again, come to breakpoint.org. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
You can learn more about Breakpoint and the Colson Center for Christian Worldview when you visit breakpoint.org. That's breakpoint.org.
Back on Breakpoint this week, John Stonestreet here along with Shane Morris. Shane, just here at the end of the week, a story hit the headlines, and it's interesting. It's rare that kind of Christian celebrities cross over into mainstream culture. It does happen. John Crist has been a comedian. I think probably could be put into that category, at least in terms of the audience that he generates on his traveling shows and so on. He's a comedian, does a lot of making fun of Christian culture, in the same way that the Babylon Bee has done. But, really troubling allegations this week, as reported by Charisma magazine, and seemed to be corroborated by enough independent sources, that Crist has canceled the rest of his shows for 2019, given some sexual impropriety, harassment, abuse of his position, vulnerable women, and so on. And it's just kind of, I remember when the hashtag Me Too and the hashtag Church Too stuff broke. Gosh, has it been a couple years now? That, back when Ed Stetzer was my guest host or my weekly co-host on Breakpoint this week, he made that point that, look, this is not going away anytime soon. There's going to be more and more and more stories. And I know a lot of people found this troubling. I mean, I had plenty of Facebook friends that were at his show this week and talked about how much they loved it and enjoyed it. And yet it seems like some of this misbehavior was going on for quite a while, that people knew it. And that, now it's just kind of come to light, and it's a sad and tragic thing.
Well, it's just so disheartening, it's hard to even express it. I've compared it with this scene in H.G. Wells' Time Machine where the time traveler meets the Elu, and he thinks they're this ideal, beautiful society. But then every night after the sun goes down, there are all these screams you hear, and someone is dragged away, and they're never seen again or heard from. And it turns out they're these horrible, hairy Morlock creatures that they eat the Elu like cattle. But nobody even talks about it. They just sort of pretend it didn't happen in the morning. And I think we're in a similar situation with sexual sin in the church. It's just like it never ends. It's just a continual drumbeat of scandal after scandal after scandal. And I wrote this article a couple of years ago now. It was a call to men, be afraid of yourself. And my basic idea was just that, in the midst of this drumbeat of high-profile scandals with pastors and apologists and artists falling into sexual sin, I simply just asked if it's time we stop trusting ourselves, stop thinking we have the fortitude to stand up against this stuff on our own without the help of the church. I even said you should get to the point where you're afraid to be alone with yourself in a room. Stop counting on your own integrity. That's not what the body of Christ is for. We're told to flee from sexual sin. And I think there's a reason for that. I think that God knows we are not meant to confront it on our own. We're meant to have that accountability. We're meant to have the body supporting us and keeping us from this kind of stuff. And it's just so sad, but I think we're obligated to figure out a better strategy for addressing this sort of thing, especially among high-profile Christian leaders.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like the Mike Pence or Billy Graham rule isn't enough. Not only don't be alone with someone of the opposite sex, don't be alone with yourself. And I remember that piece, Shane, and it's a good piece, and we'll link to it at breakpoint.org. I think that's such a good warning because, lest the church be tempted to draw the line of good and evil, outside of the church door. These stories remind us that Solzhenitsyn was right, that the line of good and evil is right down the middle of every human heart. There's no good guys and bad guys in this biblical story of the world. That's just not how the world works. There's bad guys and there's God who in Christ brings us forgiveness. And I think that's really important. The other thing that I want to point out that I think is a reminder, and I think Rachel Den Hollander, who we've talked about before, she's the one who brought Larry Nassar down, strong Christian. Now her kind of focus is actually on the church and the ongoing sexual scandal in the church and the hiding of sexual abuse over and over and over and over again. And there's elements of this in the John Crist story. And again, I'm not sure we know what we know. I just want to say elements of this without going any deeper. But I'll tell you this. One of the things that's coming up over and over in these revelations about the church is that church after church and Christian community after Christian community and people after people are just far too likely to cover up and to try to silence the victim in one way or the other. And I'm not saying that that there's not even guilt in many of these cases on both sides. What I'm saying is that the church always does its best work when it runs to the victims, not away from the victims. And we're not seeing nearly enough of that in any of these stories. I want to come back to talking about kind of, I guess it's somewhat related, maybe not completely related, but just in the little time we have left, I want to go to my state. And for everyone who doesn't know, around the Colson Center team, we give Shane a hard time because he's in Florida. And if you've never done this, Googled Florida man and your birthday, you need to do it, although what may come up will shock you because there's this legendary Florida man that keeps doing crazy things and they make these headlines and you can't make up some. So we give Shane, our resident Florida man, a really hard time. But there's two incidents in Colorado that and it's not, we kind of laugh at what we find in Florida man. But Colorado man right now, what's happening in my state is deeply troubling. For some reason, when you talk about mass shootings, when you talk about even intentions of mass violence, there's a disproportionate level of incidents that pop up in my state of Colorado. Just last Friday, 27-year-old Colorado man was arrested because he was planning to blow up a 30-family synagogue, a historic Jewish synagogue in Pueblo. He's a former KKK member, now a neo-Nazi. In Boulder, just recently as well. Men dressed up as rabbis were handing out anti-Semitic flyers at the Pearl Street Mall, and they were denying the Holocaust and so on, and all the kind of the typical anti-Semitic sorts of tripe that gets repeated over and over and over. And I'm going to ask the question, when you look at, I've talked before about there's a high suicide rate in my state. There's a high level, certainly, of opioid addiction in my state. Shane, you and I spent a lot of time on this after that kind of weekend of mass shootings months ago, that America is failing young men, and we're leading them to acts of despair or deaths from despair. And I think my state is right now facing a real problem. Apparently, we are failing the young men in Colorado, and I think we have got to own up to it.
Yeah, if you look at each of these cases, and not everyone fits the profile, but there's a consistent pattern that emerges, John, and it is that these guys are young men. You know, they're the ones who we've referred to as the lost boys before. I think it really comes down to that aspect. You've hit on it. And there aren't that many voices out there saying this is the problem. You know, you'll get things like, oh, video games are the problem, or the internet's the problem, or music is the problem, or whatnot. I think it really comes down to a loss of any sort of life script for young men, if I can put it that way. They're having trouble finding their identity and their purpose. And so they're delving into radical and evil ideologies, mostly found, online. But that's just the vehicle. I actually wrote about this after before the weekend you mentioned at the Poway Synagogue shooting earlier this year, speaking of anti-Semitism. And I said that basically anyone is susceptible to this kind of thing, no matter their background, no matter how wholesome their family appears. But I took it one step deeper as sort of a call to know your children, especially your boys, your young men, not just to keep them isolated from the poisonous influences they may encounter online, but also to offer them something good and solid and real that they can, enthrone at the center of their lives and sink their teeth into instead. There's something about our time uniquely, John, and I'm convinced of this, and our culture that leaves boys looking for something more in life, and they're having trouble finding it. There's a lot of reasons why that may be, and we don't have time to talk about them all. But I take this sort of thing as a wake-up call, that it's our duty as parents and especially as dads to show these powerful, dangerous, fearfully, wonderfully made creatures we call boys how to direct themselves toward virtue, toward mercy, toward self-sacrifice, and not toward this kind of fear and hatred and conspiracy theories.
I think it was Friedrich Nietzsche who said, "He who has a why can live with any what." And I look at all of our explanations for these acts of violence or these threats or these, deaths from despair, and it's all what's, it's this what or that what. It's video games, it's, proliferation, it's pharmaceutical companies. And I'm not saying that there's no guilt in any of those things, but those things are perfect storms. Evil is really attractive in some cultures and in some cultural settings and situations, and really not attractive in others. There's a reason where all of that stuff, the draw to kind of extremist ideology and all that is reaching young people right now. So we're spending all of our time in our diagnosis looking at these whats, and I think we've got to look at the why. Young men don't know who they are. They don't know why they exist. They don't know what they're for. They don't know what God has created them for. They don't have any bigger vision of life. And so they're attracted either to the Joker-like chaos, or they're attracted to these radical ideologies. And you and I talked about that, Shane, where if you look at the mass shootings and the perpetrators of the mass shootings, you're not going to find a ton of similarities. You're going to find a few. But what you're going to find is that they're coming out of one of two lines. They're coming out of an extremist ideology like white supremacy or radical Islam, or they're coming out of this meaninglessness, nihilism, extremism that we saw with Dylan Klebold and Eric Harris and the Aurora Theater shooter. Again, all from Colorado. This is something I think that we need to keep our eye on and continue to talk about. But it's something that also, as you look around, Shane, you say, which institution of society, which one can actually do something about this? Which institution can actually change the way this is headed? It's not government. It's not education. It's the family and the church. And again, Christians are called to run into the brokenness and not run away from it. Well, listen, thanks for joining us this week and every week on Breakpoint this week as we talk about the stories of the culture from a Christian worldview. There's plenty of stories we didn't even have time to get to, but come to breakpoint.org. We'll link you to the different resources and articles and things that we talked about on today's program. For Shane Morris, I'm John Stonestreet. Thanks for joining us.